Good evening, and welcome to all of our guests. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Melissa Huber. I'm the Director of Programs and Communication at Humanities Texas, and I get the pleasure of introducing our program this evening. For those of you who are new to Humanities Texas, we are a private nonprofit based in Austin, and we are the state partner to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our mission is to promote the humanities and humanities education statewide across the big state of Texas, and we do that through a range of programs. We conduct in-person and online workshops for teachers. We circulate traveling exhibitions. We award grants to nonprofits throughout Texas. We run a storytime program promoting family literacy, and we also have a reading and discussion program for veterans and their loved ones. We're currently running one of those programs in Tyler, Texas. And of course, we also have online lectures and discussions. Tonight's lecture with Dr. Juan David Coronado is the third in the series of online lectures that we have been hosting on the history and culture of sports in Texas. So again, thank you for joining us. One quick note before I get to introductions. There is a Q&A box on your screen. So if you would please submit any questions that you have there rather than in the chat, that's where we'll look for some of your discussion questions. And with that, let's get started. I'm happy to introduce our moderator this evening, Dr. Aram Goudsouzian. Dr. Goudsouzian is the Bizo Family Professor of History at the University of Memphis. He writes and teaches about civil rights, the modern United States, and the history of American sports. Along with Jamie Schultz, he's the editor of the Sports and Society series published by the University of Illinois Press. And at the University of Memphis, he has also served as department chair and as director of the Marcus W. Orr Center for the Humanities. We have also been very fortunate that he has served as a faculty member for a number of our Humanities Texas programs for teachers around the state. So we're very thankful for that, and also to have him here tonight. Thank you, Aram. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Humanities Texas for hosting this event. And as Melissa was suggesting, I've been a friend of Humanities Texas for quite some time, working with our teacher workshops and with this wonderful new series that we've been doing on sports in the Lone Star State. This is the third installment of that series. The previous ones have been with Frank Gurity, who wrote an excellent book called about the Texas Sports Revolution, that looked at sort of a long view of 20th century sports in Texas and how important it's been to the nation. And then our more recent one was with Scott Sosebee about the Dallas Cowboys and the Houston Oilers in the 70s and 80s, and about their sort of contrasting and very interesting histories. It's been a pleasure to work with Humanities Texas and with Melissa and with Kelsey and with Eric Luper and met everybody else there over the course of this time. I'm very thrilled to be here tonight speaking with Juan David Coronado. And our topic tonight is entitled Baseball on the Board. Juan David is an associate professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. He has a PhD in history from Texas Tech University. And then he was a postdoctoral scholar at the Julian Zamora Research Institute at Michigan State University. He's a native of the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas. He taught at the University of Texas Pan American, which is in his own hometown of Edinburgh. And that's where he received his BA and his MA as well in history. His research interests include the Mexican-American military experience, Chicano and Chicana history, oral history, Latino history, and an emphasis on class and gender. He's the author of a book called, quote, "I'm Not Gonna Die in This Damn Place: Manliness, Identity, and Survival of the Mexican-American Vietnam Prisoners of War." That book was published with the Michigan State University Press in 2018. He's also written a whole host of book chapters and articles about various aspects of history, including about Chicano pop culture, Latino business pioneers, and the Latino and Latina history in the Midwest. Most significant for us tonight, he is the co-editor of a photo book entitled Mexican-American Baseball in South Texas, and an article that was published in the Journal of the West called, quote, "A Divided Community United on the Diamond, the 1962 Hidalgo County Colt League Baseball World Series Champion." And that article was later reprinted in a bound volume, in an edited collection called Latinos and Latinas in American Schools. I'm thrilled to be here with Juan David. We'll be in conversation, and there'll be times when he'll pull up slides and expound on some topics as well. Before I ask him the first question, though, I did want to again emphasize to everyone who's here, and I'm so thankful that you're all here, to please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A. We will reserve time at the end of today's session for questions from the audience, but you can drop your questions in at any time, and I can mix them in the midst of my Q&A at times too. So if you have a question that's relevant at that moment, especially, please drop it in. But remember, you can drop in your questions at any time into the Q&A. All right, let's start with our first question for Juan. Juan, give us a little sense of how you came to this topic of Mexican-American baseball. Your dissertation, which was your first book, was about a very different subject, right, in terms of Mexican-American POWs in Vietnam. So how did you come to baseball in the Rio Grande Valley?
Well, thank you, Aram, for that introduction, and thank you, Kelsey and Melissa, for setting this up, and thanks to Texas Humanities. It's a really good question, Aram. I had just finished my dissertation in 2013, and I was teaching in my hometown as a lecturer, full-time lecturer, and I was a lecturer, but I did not have much research funds. And I had just finished a dissertation on Vietnam War prisoners of war, which very difficult to work with. You know, the very emotional stories. You know, dealing with trauma, dealing with high casualties and things of that nature. So I really needed to put Vietnam at a standstill. I needed to take a break from that, but I also wanted to keep researching, right? And I didn't have much funding for any research on Vietnam or other aspects of military history. So I decided to take up on a local topic in my home county of Hidalgo. A good friend of mine, Omar Rivera, who's a brilliant researcher, one of the greatest I've ever met, has a great knowledge on local history. And off and on, we would have these conversations about the 1962 Hidalgo Colt World Series team. And he goes, "Hey, man, you got to write it. You got to write it." And I said, "What the heck, you know? I'm gonna start it off, and I'm a real big practitioner of oral history. So I started making the contacts in the community, and before I knew it, I had all these interviews lined up, and it was a success. And I really got into the local history down in Edinburgh, McAllen, Mission, all the way down to Brownsville. And I really enjoyed that project. It was one of those very necessary projects that took me away from what I had been doing previously, but kept me very productive. You know.
Great. Before we get into the baseball aspect of it, maybe if you can give us sort of the broad historical patterns of Mexican American life in the general period that you're investigating, maybe dating back to the 20s and 30s, but on into the 60s, 70s, 80s, what are the big changes that we see? What's the general status of Mexican Americans? If you could just sort of paint that sort of political, economic, social picture, that might help ground us before we get into the sports itself.
So the Mexican American, the Chicano community in South Texas is going through a huge transition, and of course we got to tell the story prior to the early 1900s, right? We go back to the U.S.-Mexican War and what was happening in that area of the world at the time of the U.S. invasion of northern Mexico, right? The Rio Grande Valley almost was at a standstill because it was claimed by Texas, and then Mexico. Mexico still claimed it, and the U.S. takes over. But for a very long time, that area was not really on anyone's radar. You start to see definitely local people that had been there for a while. But by the 19-teens, you see a transition. You see a transition of Anglo-American newcomers, folks from the Midwest, folks from the North, that began to come into the area. You see the transition of lands primarily owned by Mexicanos, by Mexican Americans, being switched over to the Anglo-American landowners, right? And with that, you see tremendous shift on the lives of Chicano people. In the 19 teens, you have la matanza of many Mexicanos, innocent Mexican Americans that were labeled as bandits or identified with banditry. So you see a very dark chapter in the history of South Texas during the 19 teens, as you have this transition to an Anglo dominance of that area. You see very similar situations as you see in the U.S. South, right? U.S. South, we know well about. We're very well versed with what happens with Jim Crow. In South Texas, you have a similar type of Jim Crow. You see Mexican American communities that will be segregated. You see many folks living in poverty, and of course, in the grand scheme of things, the 20s, 30s, you're dealing with a Great Depression. So you see a very challenging time for Raza down there in the Rio Grande Valley, right? Moving forward in the 40s and 50s, post World War II, you start to see changes, social economic changes, political changes, as those folks coming back from World War II come back with a different vision of a better society, right? So by the time that these young men are growing up, they're still facing the segregation, they're still facing the discrimination in their communities, but they start to see a way for upward mobility and for change, right? And really, the story about the 62 Colts is really that, a story of underdogs, a story of these small kids that had a lot of fight in them, and that's the spirit of the Mexicano there in South Texas. That regardless of what the situation is, they're very resilient and they will overcome.
Before we get to the All-Stars in 62, there seems to be a historical figure of great significance in South Texas baseball, a name that in my very limited reading on the subject, I kept coming across, of Leonardo Alanís, known as Leo Najo, right? Can you tell us about him, who he was and why he's such a significant figure?
Sure. There's a photo of Leo Najo right there. Very nice photo from Leo Najo. I believe he was playing in San Antonio in this particular photo. Played for San Antonio Missions in the 20s. Leo Najo came from Nuevo León, Mexico, pretty close to where my family's from in Nuevo León. His mother brought he and his siblings to Mission, Texas, where he grew up. And Leo Najo excelled in baseball. He was drafted by the Chicago White Sox in 1925, but had a terrible leg injury and did not get to compete with the White Sox. But he spent the majority of his baseball career playing minor league ball in places like Omaha, places like San Antonio, other parts of Texas, Oklahoma. And he becomes a local legend in Mission, particularly, and in other parts of the region. During a time where baseball was very much flourishing in South Texas, Leo Najo becomes a huge promoter of the sport. He's a coach, manager down there in Mission. He gave neighborhood kids lessons in how to play better, how to strike the ball better, how to bunt, how to run the bases quicker. So he became a community figure in Mission. To this day, we have Leo Najo celebrations in the city of Mission, Texas. They do an annual Leo Najo Day. They have their own Leo Najo Sports Hall of Fame, where they induct local sports heroes or local athletes. And when I was doing the research, I'm glad that you brought up the question. One of the groups that I linked up with was these gentlemen that you see in white. They call themselves the Leo Najo Old Timers Organization. And they were just a fountain of knowledge Some of them played semi-pro ball. Some of them played college ball. Got a couple of umpires here, and they just were very welcoming and sharing their knowledge with me and setting up meetings and just some of the photos that you see from this presentation are from these old timers that were just so willing to help in the research. So that's a little bit about Leonajo.
As I was reading the book that your essay was in on sport in Latina communities, there was the essay by Alberto Rodriguez about right before yours, the one about sort of the extent of baseball in South Texas and its growth and its role in Mexican American communities that your own essay expounds upon. Can you tell us a little bit about this longer history? It seems like there's a very robust, vibrant history of baseball in the region. Minor league teams and players who would go on to some to professional opportunities.
Yeah. I always tell my students, wherever you see the U.S. military in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you're going to see the rise of baseball. Right? Places like Puerto Rico, places like Cuba, places like Dominican Republic, places like Panama, South Texas. This is one of the first records that we see baseball on the border, and this is from Christmas Day, 1868. Where you have a team from Brownsville, Texas, challenge a team from across the river in Matamoros. And the score sounds ridiculous, 49-32. It sounds more like a football game. But this is how early we start seeing baseball here in South Texas. We start to see teams challenge each other, not just on the American side, but on the Mexican side as well. And it was very common for these folks to have games, whether in Mexico or in the US, playing each other. By the 19-teens, you start to see sandlot ball in places like Far, places like Brownsville, places like Madero and outside of Mission. And these were some of the earlier photos that I was able to collect during the research down there. But I really saw that by the end of World War I and World War II is really when you start to see this incredible rise in interest in baseball. These were veterans coming back from World War I, World War II, the Korean conflict. And, what I began to put together, especially for those World War II guys, they really needed an activity coming back home. And of course, they didn't call it PTSD at the time, but they were obviously dealing with, the trauma of being in warfare. And they began to organize baseball games in the community. And those baseball games grew to organizing leagues. And you start to see the rise of semi-pro baseball throughout the Rio Grande Valley, whether it's Cameron County, Hidalgo County, Willacy and Star. And it was these World War II guys that really began to organize. One of them is the guy in the middle in glasses, not wearing the military uniform. He's a man by the name of Ramon Cantu. And Ramon Cantu from Edinburgh, World War II veteran, began to organize ball games and then began to organize leagues, right? The picture on top is Adolfo Argijo. He's a World War I veteran, and you probably tell from the uniform. Adolfo Argijo was actually drafted by the New York Yankees in the 20s as well, and also from that Mission area, and was very significant in organizing games, coaching down there, and being very active in the baseball world of South Texas, right? The picture on the lower left, when I was doing this research, this is 2015. This is about 8 years ago. The gentleman on the left is actually my junior high gym coach. I hadn't seen him in years, and when I connected with that Leonajo group, there's Coach Steves. Coach Esteves, which I did not know this when I was a kid in junior high. He was a really good baseball player. Got to play high school. Went off to New Mexico and played off at New Mexico Highlands College ball, and then came back and played in the various semi-pro teams that existed in South Texas, and just had just a wealth of knowledge and memories to share. And a lot of these photographs came from Coach Esteves, and he was able to share those with me when I was putting that book together. And you see teams such as this, the from my hometown, the Joe Davis Jenner semi-pro team, going back to the 50s. Donna, Texas had the Donna Cardinals in the 50s as well. Just about every community in South Texas had one or two ball clubs here in the 40s and 50s. Brownsville had such a rich history of baseball. Here you have the Brownsville Regals, and their ballpark not too far from the border. Just incredible baseball history here in the 50s and going forward. And I like this collection of photos because it shows, from organized ball team here in San Manuel. San Manuel is a rural community north of Edinburgh, to a little to a toddler, swinging a bat at a very young age, to a group of men out here. Some of them seemed like they just got out of work, out there checking out a baseball game, right? And even women were playing here in the 40s. We got the 46 Brownsville Simpson Packard Clippers, who went on to win the Texas Amateur Athletic Federation Tournament Championship. So you see tremendous baseball activity here in South Texas. Couple other ones that I'll share. The one on the left are a couple teams from Mission, Texas. For those of you who do not know this, Mission has a couple of legendary sports heroes. We mentioned Leonajo earlier, mentioned Arguijo, but this is also hometown of Tom Landry. Tom Landry, famous football coach for the Dallas Cowboys for many years. Tom Landry actually played baseball for the Mission 3030 semi-pro team out there in Mission, right? McAllen, which is one of the larger cities in South Texas, also had a team out there, the McAllen Dons. So we see baseball in every little corner of South Texas. Yeah.
There's an interesting question in the chat from Brandon Blakesley, who asks if the baseball teams from South Texas traveled into Latin America to play. There was the tradition of barnstorming teams, or vice versa. Did barnstorming teams from Latin America come into South Texas? Do you see any kind of interchange in that regard?
Yeah, it was very common. On a weekend, it was very common for ball players from the Valley, from Texas, crossing into places like Reynosa, Matamoros, Camargo, Miguel Alemán, some of the border towns, and some further into Mexico, like Monterrey. Some went as far as Tampico. And it was very common for players to go back and forth and just go out there for an outing, a nice Sunday matinee, and vice versa. It was common for teams from Mexico to come play some of these teams from South Texas. Yeah. And here in the 50s and 60s, it was very common, and it was that border slightly different from the border that we recognize today. That border has become heavily militarized, and it's a little more challenging to go through through customs nowadays. But even when I was growing up, it was a lot easier to cross back and forth, and these baseball teams did it quite often. It was very common for these guys to go down there just for a quick outing, and the passion was there. Yeah, absolutely. Good question.
I know as a student sometimes of African American sports history, there's a tension in thinking about the role of sports in the larger political communities, right? In the sense that does sports serve as a vehicle to challenge segregation and to challenge inequality, or is it more largely reflective of the segregation and the inequality that Black communities face? You talked about earlier about how Mexican American communities in South Texas were facing elements that were similar to the Jim Crow system that Black people faced in the South. So, what can you tell us about sports in terms of those political issues, in terms of this larger segregation? Did sports reflect the segregation? Did it combat it? What's your analysis there?
You know, by the time that I'm writing about this team in the 60s, we also need to understand everything that's taken place, right? In South Texas, you have primarily two main civil rights groups that are fighting and advocating for Mexican American civil rights. You have LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and you have the American GI Forum, right? And definitely by the early 60s, these two organizations have been successful in breaking down some of these barriers, right? You go back to the Westminster case, the Mendez versus Westminster case in 47, that argued that Mexican American Latino students could not be segregated, right? In 54, we have the huge Hernandez case, Hernandez versus Texas, that argued that even though Mexican Americans were considered white, they were not treated as white, and that they were protected by the 14th Amendment and they deserved equal protection of the law. So by the 60s, you're starting to see some change in the community. However, you also continue to see signs such as the ones you're seeing on this slideshow here. When I was researching and interviewing some of the ball players, they reminded themselves, and they reminded me, the interviewer, that they were not welcome in all places, right? So to answer your question, the times are changing, right? To use Bob Dylan's quote, the times are changing by the 60s, but these are baby steps. These are baby steps, and the sports world is reflective of that. But you also see in the sports world an avenue for collaboration, for integration. And the team that I write about was half Latino, half Mexican, and Mexican American, and half white. So you do see that sports becomes an avenue for further integration and for further communication or negotiating those racial lines. I like to say that baseball blurs those lines at times, and we see that in the major leagues as well. Where some of the earlier Latino players, that enter the major leagues, and I'm talking about before Jackie Robinson, they're portrayed as of pure Spanish blood, or they were trying to, they were being sold as something other than people of color, right? So it's a little tricky, when you're talking about the Latino experience. It somewhat parallels the Black experience, but with a few exceptions and some differences.
Right. That's very interesting. Why don't you take us to the story of the 62 Colt League All-Stars? You talked a little bit about how you got interested in the story and how you grew out of some of your conversations. You talked a little bit about some of your research, but give us the full picture. Tell us about this team and what they meant.
So I'm the type of historian that if I'm not passionate about the topic, I'm just not going to write about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an oral historian, so I need to hear the voices of the participants, of the people who were there. I need to dig through the newspapers and get a good feel for what I'm writing about. But once I started talking to these former ball players and really hearing their story, I really got into it, and I was obsessed with the topic, and And the story is about baseball, but it's also about the history of South Texas. And it's about, what these individuals went through on a daily basis to participate on this team, right? So Hidalgo County is right on the border with Mexico, right? And in 1962, you have a group of these young men, 16 young men who formed the all-star team for the county. And these boys were from throughout the county. And we're talking about people from Edinburgh, McAllen, Mission, FAR, Peñitas, and this team's assembled, and they're really good. They're really good. And like I said earlier, they were split down the middle. 8 of them were Anglo-American, 8 of them were Mexican-American. The coach was Mexican-American. The assistant coach, Roby, was Anglo-American from FAR. And they came together in the summer of 62 to compete. And these boys, it was interesting interviewing them and getting them to talk about their experiences. But, one thing that came over and over again was just the challenges that they had in convincing their family members to allow them to participate. When I interviewed some of the Mexican-American young boys, many of their families, so historically or traditionally, many families left South Texas during the summertime. The South Texas heat was brutal, and a lot of these folks relied on agricultural labor in the summer. And that, because of the heat, comes to an end in South Texas. So what a lot of families did traditionally was that they left South Texas for the summer, and they migrated as seasonal workers, and they followed the Cotton Trail to El Campo, to outside of Houston, to West Texas. Some of them left the state for better opportunities during the summertime, right? And a couple of these young boys, their families were migrants, right? So some of them had to convince their parents, say, hey, we're kind of in a big tournament. Can you allow me to stay this summer, right? So just to get them to talk about those experiences was really interesting, right? So overall, they overcome these challenges. They convince their parents to let them play, and they play ball that summer. And from the get-go, the team is on fire throughout South Texas. They move up to regionals. They're playing very well. They get to the Houston area. They get to Abilene, and they're just playing amazing ball, right? And I think they get to know each other during that time. Both Mexican-American and the Anglo-American kids get to know each other. There were a couple of very touching stories in what they went through. When they moved up in the tournament and playing in Abilene, 2 of the Mexican-American young boys went off to try to get a hamburger. And they sit down at a counter, and they never get served. Their teammate comes over, and automatically he gets served. And he was white American, and he gets served. And he asked them, hey, what did you guys order? Like, well, we never were able to order. They never came around to take our order. And they get the server's attention, and the server tells them, we don't serve Mexicans here. And at that point, their teammate tells them, hey, let's get out of here. And they all leave. The young boy who had ordered didn't even pay for his order. They just left. It was getting to those communities that were unknown to the young boys that created challenges. In South Texas, they knew where they were welcome and where they were not welcome. But in these places where they did not know the culture or what, they ran into these situations of discrimination, right? But they did also speak on how this created a closer bond with their teammates. Perhaps teammates prior to this really didn't know what life was like for a Mexicano, a Mexican American growing up in an era of segregation, right? So these, the team created bonds, and they finally get to the Final Four in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Final Four in Shawnee, Oklahoma. There's a team out of Pensacola, Florida. There's a team out of Michigan. There's a team out of Virginia, and the team out of California. And I think there had to be a playing game for them to get in. They make the Final Four, and they make it all the way to the finals against a team out of Riverside, California. And on the team of Riverside, California, you have future Hall of Famer Bobby Bonds, Barry Bonds' father. And he was an amazing player at that time. And in order to defeat and win the championship, this Texas team had to beat the Riverside team, the California team, twice. And they're able to do that. And it was a double elimination tournament. And they're able to eliminate the Riverside team to win the championship. And I think the team is symbolic of the adversity that South Texas communities were facing at the time. They were always the underdogs. They were always smaller, shorter, skinnier than the other ball teams, but they had heart. They had heart, and they played very hard here in the summer of '62, and brought recognition not only to the team but to the entire community who embraced them when they came back to South Texas.
It's interesting. Your story really reinforces the idea. And when I say myth, I don't mean it as a lie, but rather like as the common story we often tell that sports can forge a team ethic and can bring people together across their differences. And it seems to be the case with this team, right? That it really is like almost like a Disney movie in that sense, right? That here are these kids from across the tracks who come together in this common endeavor and have a championship. And here I'd like to connect it to your practice as an oral historian, right? You were interviewing these young men, or these men who were old but about their experiences when they're 15, 16 years old.
Right.
That certainly must bring some challenges as an oral historian. And I'm also wondering about your interview subjects, and were the Mexicans and the Anglos remembering things in different ways and telling different kinds of stories? I'm just curious about sort of that larger practice of oral history and how it shaped this project.
Absolutely. When interviewing the Mexican American ball players, they remembered the barriers, the challenges that they went through growing up, where they talked about, having to either walk or bike or run through segregated communities just to get to the ballpark, right? Or, talking to me about having to attend the Mexican school in the community because the schools were segregated, or telling me about the segregation that existed in places like Mission, Texas. What cafes were open to them, which ones were not, what movie theaters they were welcomed at, which ones they were not, public swimming pools. They would tell me about the pools that they were not allowed to swim at. And time again, when talking to the Mexican American ball players, some of these issues came up. Repeatedly they came up. For the Anglo-American ball players, they didn't live through that. They had no words to speak on the segregation that existed in the community. They just did not remember that aspect of growing up. They had just a different. They lived in a different world, like you said earlier. On the other side of the tracks. South Texas Rio Grande Valley for a long time, the main highway was Business 83. Now, of course, there's an expressway, but the railroad tracks ran along Business 83, dividing each community north and south. And that's how communities were divided, right? So it was really interesting on what certain folks would remember and what other folks would remember. When talking to the Mexican American men, they could recall, some of the heroes like Leonajo, Arguijo, and some of the, exceptional Mexican American talent that existed. When talking to the Anglo ball players, they, it was not part of their world. They did live in almost worlds apart. Yeah.
Or listeners sometimes use that word positionality, right? About sort of how the interviewer is positioned against the interviewee. And I wonder if you felt like, as you were talking to people who shared your heritage and your language and your common experiences, if that was eliciting the kinds of reactions that you're talking about. Did you matter, I guess, in this story?
I don't think I mattered in the story, to be honest with you. I think I think for the very first, for perhaps the first time, someone was interested in hearing these stories, right? And maybe they did feel a little comfortable in opening up because of who I am, right? But they spoke about these experiences not always in a negative manner, not that they were complaining, but that this was part of their day. If they wanted to be part of this baseball team, guess what? They had to walk 10 blocks to go play ball, and they were happy because they were playing ball, and for that young man that I shared the story with, that he had to convince his parents not to take him on this migrant seasonal seasonal work, he was happy, and he clearly said it in the oral history. He's like, hey, no tuve que ir a la pizca, I didn't have to go pick cotton that day, that summer. So it for people who lived that, and it just became normalized, they endured a lot, and they weren't openly complaining. They were reminiscing about those challenges, but also acknowledging the fact that they understood that in that society, they were second-class citizens, right? And faced those barriers as second-class citizens. Yeah.
It's interesting. There's such a rich history of sport as a vehicle into understanding social tensions, and often over race and ethnicity. And I think the work that you're doing here with the Colt League team in '62 adds another rich chapter to that, because it really gets a human experience. A lot of what's been written about Latinos in baseball is focused on what's gone at the professional level, and there's the wonderful books by Samuel Regalado, among others, that are focused on the Latino experience and in the pros and the connections across Latin America. But your focus on local communities gives us another very important dimension into that issue. There was a question from Carlos Femat. I think it came prior to our discussion of the Colt League All-Stars. I think so. Just for the context of the question, but he asked, did any players receive pay for play? A number of the teams that you mentioned were semi-pro teams, so I assume that they were the players were paid.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The semi-pro teams, definitely, they were getting paid. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about with your little leaguers? Was there ever any enticements for them to join the team?
I guess the enticement was the young man didn't have to go pick cotton that summer. And that was an enticement.
That's enticement enough. Yeah.
That's enticement enough. Yeah. And same thing with some of the Anglo-American boys. Some of them worked construction with their dads, and they did mention some of that as well. Yeah.
We talked at the beginning about how your early work was in military history, and you reflected on it a little bit about how sports history in some ways was a break from writing about the traumatic experiences of military service, and particularly for prisoners of war, I'd imagine, and particularly for a war like Vietnam. But I wonder also if you see any parallels between writing military history and sport history, maybe in terms of their significance within Latino and Latina communities, maybe in terms of the structure, in terms of how you put together the story. I'm just curious what you think.
It's something that I thought about a while back when I was finishing up this project, and there's obviously some parallels. One of my areas of study is gender history. I do the study of masculinity and manliness, and what the literature reflects in terms of manliness and masculinity, especially for that Vietnam War generation. Two things that really stood these young men apart growing up. One of them was military service, and the other one was sports. And the way they made a name for themselves was through those two things, was, excelling in sports, whether it's at that high school level, and then, joining the military. And a lot of the Vietnam vets mentioned that it was expected of them, whether it was a family tradition of a family military tradition, or an expectation, but many of them equated their military service with their fulfillment of masculine duties. And the literature reflects on how baseball was used as an avenue to showcase that as well. The other thing that parallels is how that generation back then viewed sports, and baseball specifically. For many of these young people going back to these times, baseball was that avenue where they could become part of that society that dominant society, but that could also, they could add to that culture as well. So it was somewhat of a way of acceptance, if for lack of a better term, that a way they could be further accepted in this society that didn't always see them as equals. And at the same time, it was them embracing, their manliness. But there's been some works done on how baseball served as an avenue for acculturation,
Mhm.
right? And how they pick up the dominant culture of that area, and really began to try to settle into this community that hasn't always been equal, or hasn't always given them access to equity. Yeah.
I wonder if then, I think you've been talking about the very issue, but sort of sports in the military are also in some ways, and obviously much more explicitly in the military, but kind of claims to citizenship as well, or full participation in the society, right? Like especially baseball's explicit marketing of itself as the national pastime, as a sport bathed in patriotism, as this is what makes you American, right?
Yeah.
In a way that perhaps has been replaced by American football since the 70s and 80s and beyond. But in the way the military has often been such a primary vehicle for claims of citizenship among minority groups.
And that's very, very much true for this World War I generation, World War II generation, Korean War generation, where Mexican Americans coming back from Europe, after World War II, they really feel that even though they were U.S. born, but had never been treated as Americans, now they feel that they've earned their full citizenship. Like, hey, we're out there fighting the Nazis. We're out there representing democracy. We're out there defending democracy. We want a first-class citizenship now. We're demanding a first-class citizenship now, right? We did our part. We deserve this, right? We earned it, even though by law they were already citizens, but they didn't have that first-class citizenship. And same thing with sports, and same thing with baseball. It almost seemed like it was this avenue to get further acceptance by the dominant society and get that type of first class citizenship. And of course, here in the 60s, we're talking about the early years of the Vietnam War. Things are about to change, right? Because this younger generation coming up is saying, hey, we really don't have to die for our country to be considered patriots, right? We're already Americans. We're born here, right? We don't need to be out there. We don't need to be a patriot missile to be a patriot. But it is part of that conversation of a first class citizenship.
Yeah, thank you. Looking at the Q&A, Raul Maripin has more of a comment than a question, which says, my father was very proud that Mexican players played for their hometowns and smaller towns. And that kind of reinforces part of your argument about sort of the role of sport in these communities, right? And how central they were, both to not just to that larger claim of national identity and citizenship, but also to Mexican American communities themselves, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They were so proud of donning that uniform of whatever community it was. And it's amazing looking back, some of these communities that we would probably consider either non-existent or small colonias nowadays, small villages, places like Madero, Texas, outside of Mission, they had ball clubs going back to the 40s and 50s. These were thriving little communities back then, and people were very proud of representing their community and playing ball, and winning a game in the name of their given town. Very, very proud of that. Yeah. Thank you for that comment.
Then we have a question from Mr. Coman again that asks, did any of the 1962 champs go on to play college ball? And I might just sort of expand on that question and say, since you interviewed so many of them and got a sense of their lives after this experience, if you could just tell us about sort of the trajectory of their lives after first, of course, engaging with this question about college baseball.
So yeah, a couple of these young men went out to play college ball. The young man receiving the trophy there, shorter guy, Robert Zamora. Robert Zamora went off to play college ball. I believe he also played for New Mexico Highlands. He was a catcher on the team and co-captain, and he was named MVP of the tournament. And he went off to play college ball. A couple of the other guys played college ball. Robert Zamora, actually, I started my research interviewing him. And by this point in life, he had become superintendent of schools in La Jolla. At the time that I interviewed him, he was a faculty member at University of Texas Pan American, got his PhD at University of Texas at Austin. And being that he was a central figure of the team, he had all these contacts, and he's really the one who put me in contact with most of his teammates. And several of the other guys, I think somebody played, Hinojosa played junior college ball, junior college there in Texas. Yeah, maybe about 3 or 4 of these guys played college ball. All of them played high school ball. In terms of what they did for a living, a couple of them served in Vietnam. Couple of them went on to excel and professionally, like I said, Dr. Zamora went into higher ed and academia, and a couple of them ended up working construction. A couple went into the oil and gas business. Before he passed away, I got to interview this man, Ted Larson, from my hometown of Edinburgh, and he was living in, if I'm correct, Washington State. And I'm not a social media person, but when I was doing the research for this team, I did open up a social media account because I was trying to interview as many of the guys as possible. And within 48 hours of opening up that social media account, I found Ted Larson in Washington State, and he had gone to work there, if I'm not mistaken, for one of the electric companies or phone companies out there. So I got to interview him through telephone. We were having a conversation earlier before we started about how technology has expanded. It was a regular telephone call with Mr. Larson, but it was a good conversation. I know he's passed now, and yeah, you had others that went in. One individual became a mailman. So most of them ended up doing all right in life.
Mhm.
And I'm glad that they asked that question, because in the oral histories, time and time again, the young men said that baseball pushed them to excel in high school. That many of them growing up did not envision completing high school, and we got to understand the challenges for the Mexican American community going back to the '60s. Where the push out rate during that era was extremely high. Some of these young men said, "Hey, it was because of my participation in baseball that I was pushed to play baseball in high school. That meant that my grades had to be good," and they credit that experience with allowing them to succeed in life. Yeah.
Right, another sort of classic myth that we tell about sports. But again, sports is a vehicle of upward mobility, right? And again, saying myth not as a lie, but rather as a common story. And here it's being reinforced by the personal experiences of the people that you interview. Perfect.
Yeah.
I want to remind our audience members, please feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A. And while you might be doing so, I want to ask you just about your teaching, Juan David. Do you ever teach about sport history at Central Connecticut?
I incorporate sports every now and then. I'm designing a course on sports history as we speak. Still, I get pulled in so many different directions at this university.
Mm-hmm.
So I do a lot of the Latino studies courses, and this semester I'm doing a course on the Vietnam War. But I hope by next fall to teach a sports history class. But something that you brought up, and some of the myths and whatnot. Even though this was a great win for the county and a great opportunity for these young men, it didn't mean that all the struggles ended in their communities. Communities remain segregated in South Texas after this. This did not tear all those barriers down. It blurred those lines momentarily, but folks still continue to face significant challenges in South Texas, and they still do to this day. South Texas continues to be one of the most impoverished places in the country, and people continue to struggle. The segregation may not be white and Mexican American today, but there is a type of social economic segregation that remains, right? Where the Anglo-American population was more present in the '60s. By the '70s, '80s, a lot of them will leave South Texas. One of those phenomena that we see throughout the country, right? White flight. So you see a very different Rio Grande Valley today than the one we saw in the 1960s.
Thank you. And I think it's important to always keep that balance in understanding sport history, right? That we have to see, these elements of progress or hope in the larger context in which it operates, which is often, doesn't fit that myth as neat. I want to ask you a question about if baseball still had resonance in the region. And right to that point, there's a comment from Mr. Iglesias that says, these guys paved the way for Rio Grande Valley players. Now we have lots of talent in NCAA baseball, getting drafted by Major League Baseball teams. University of Texas or Rio Grande Valley baseball is doing well. Do you see any sort of historic connections between the time that you wrote about and do you still see baseball as significant in the region? Has football replaced it? Is soccer relevant?
Well, that's the thing, right? In Texas, football is always going to be king, right? But South Texas, Mr. Iglesias is correct. You still have so much baseball activity in the area. You've got young boys that play year round now. It's not just their local leagues or the high school or the high school leagues. They have a great number of traveling teams that travel year round. And that's both positive and negative, right? Because who gets to play in those teams, right? People who could afford it. But baseball is still very popular throughout South Texas. I'm kind of torn by this question because UT Rio Grande Valley, it's the new school, and it's not really a new school. It was formed out of UT Pan American and UT Brownsville, and they merged together in 2015 to form a new school. But with that, you totally lost one team in Brownsville, right? Pan American, going back in the 60s, back to the 60s and 70s, used to have really good quality teams. And not to say that they're not quality teams anymore, but you used to have teams from the Midwest who'd get down to Texas to play them in early March because of the nice weather down there. They played huge schools from the Big Ten, from throughout the country. And now, as we're under the thumb of University of Texas, we're somewhat limited in what we do down there. But still, we still see baseball flourishing down there. You still see people very, very active in the sport. Absolutely. There's another question on the chat. What the 101 on the 62 team was?
Yeah.
So you see the team says FAR 101, and according to the interviewees, these were the jerseys that belonged to the FAR, and I want to say it was the VFW team from VFW Post 101, and according to the players, that these were the nicest jerseys that they could get a hold of. This was because before going to this, forming this county team, they had a county playoff. So you had the teams from Edinburgh play the teams from FAR, play the team from Mission, and they had a little local tournament. And the team from Mission won that tournament, but the team from FAR, according to the guys, had the nicest jerseys. The only person you see wearing a different jersey is the guy on the far right. That's Coach Valadez. He's a Korean War vet that coached the team, and he's wearing his old Spikes 30-30 semi-pro baseball jersey. And the rest of the team is wearing the FAR 101 jerseys. And that was the best that that they could come up with. So, like today, there's money around, they just buy a new jersey. Back then they ran with what they had, and the FAR 101 jerseys were the nicest ones that they had. So they ran with that.
Mr. Walk's other question was about the Negro League. He's been reading about the Negro League, saw that there's a number of Latino players who played in the Negro Leagues. Were any that from Texas who played within the Negro League?
Yeah, you see a number of Latinos who found home in the Negro Leagues. I can't name anyone offhand, but it was a place for them to find a home, as the majors were not very open to the Latino ball players of that era. You see selective individuals moving into the majors, but but there were still limitations. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point.
And then another question from Raul Marroquin says, he writes, baseball wasn't very big in central and southern Mexico. Was it Major League Baseball or South Texas that caused the diffusion of baseball into northern Mexico?
I have to say it's that military presence going back to the U.S.-Mexican War, going into the Civil War, and going into the 19 teens. During the Mexican Revolution of 1910, one of the reactions of the United States government is to send about 90% of the U.S. Army down to South Texas. Right? They were very much afraid that the Mexican Revolution would spill into South Texas. So you have a large presence of military personnel there, and of course they're taking the game to South Texas, and it spreads. It spreads along the border. For folks who are not from the border area, for a very long time that river was a river. It becomes a man-made border after the U.S.-Mexican War, but there were still folks who their daily lives were in between both countries, right? And fast forwarding to the days of my youth, that border was crossed several times a day by people who either worked in the U.S. or worked in Mexico or vice versa and traveled, so that border was very fluid, right? And people really saw themselves as part of the whole region, right? Whether it was northern Mexico, South Texas, it was a region of itself, right? And like I stated earlier, people were very comfortable going to places like Reynosa, Matamoros, Monterrey to play ball. Monterrey is a huge baseball center. The last Leonajo celebration that I went to back in 2016, you had people who traveled from Monterrey to Mission, Texas, just for that ceremony. We're talking about close to a 3-hour drive to partake in that ceremony, right? And they were very comfortable doing that, right? And this was 2016, right? So definitely baseball in northern Mexico was extremely popular. Eventually, of course, you have the growth of the Mexican League throughout the Pacific and central Mexico. But as far as this conversation is concerned, my emphasis was on Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, where definitely we saw that connection there with South Texas.
Mr. Alonso in the chat actually adds the importance of transnational companies in places like Monterrey that were bringing baseball into that region as well. Interesting.
Yeah.
Juan David, before we let you go, we've learned so much from you today, and this has been a fascinating conversation, and you've really enlightened us. But what's next for you in terms of your research? Are you going to continue to pursue this subject of baseball in South Texas, or do you have other things on your agenda?
Yeah. Baseball in South Texas was just a natural topic for me, and it was probably one of the projects that I enjoyed researching and learning about the most. And I would absolutely love to continue, whether it's on baseball or some particular aspect of sports in South Texas. I just try to give a good representation of the community down there, and I definitely want to continue on that path. So yeah, I'm digging around a couple of topics now, and I'm thinking about going back to baseball in some form or another in South Texas.
Yeah, I could see a history of sport in South Texas being fascinating. I could see a larger history of baseball in the region working. I think there's a lot of avenues that if you chose to continue with this, I think you'd probably find, given the wonderful essay that you wrote, I really hope that you can contribute more to sport history. As someone who edits a series in sport history. In particular, I'd like to recruit you to that series when you're ready to write a book about
But
it.
that region is overlooked, and especially when we're looking at sports, and there's so many untold stories that definitely need to be told. So yeah, I'm definitely be in contact with you on that.
Well, to our audience, as you can see, Professor Coronado has his email address here if you want to contact him and ask him any follow-up questions. We very much enjoyed spending this hour and 10-15 minutes with you. And on behalf of everyone at Humanities Texas, I want to say thanks very much. Any parting words, Professor?
I just want to thank everyone in attendance. Thank you for setting a little time apart to learn about a topic that is near and dear to me, and a topic that is important to all of us as people as Texans or Mexican Americans or Americans in general. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you again to Texas Humanities.
As the many comments that are popping up are suggesting, it looks like our audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. Well, thank you, everyone, and goodbye.